Wayne Williams was the clerk and recorder in El Paso. He was also a county commissioner. He was also the chairman of the El Paso GOP, and for that, you know, many merits. Anyway, our Secretary of State, Wayne Williams.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you for coming out today. Thank you for being here. Joe gave some of the background, but that's not where it started. So since I'm going to be talking about caucuses and primaries, you need to know a little bit of where I come from. So 36 years ago, I was 18 years old, and I went as a voter to my first caucus in Front Royal, Virginia. And I was elected a delegate to the Republican convention. And so that happened to occur the weekend after my high school graduation. So some of my friends went to the beach to do other things. I went to Virginia Beach to be a delegate from Front Royal, Virginia, to my first state convention. And I have been to state conventions as a delegate in Virginia, in Utah, and every other year since I moved to Colorado in 1992. So that's the background. By the way, for those who don't know, my communications director, that's Lynn Bartles.
Last time I was in this room, I was with Corey Gardner on the campaign trail. Look how that turned out for you.
So that's a little bit of the background, but it's not just been that I've been a delegate to state conventions. In 1992, I was with my wife, who was an alternate delegate to the convention down in Houston, when it was slightly less water than we have now. And then I have been a delegate or alternate to 4 other Republican conventions since that time. So I am someone who has, as a delegate, as an alternate, as a caucus goer, as a precinct committee person, as a Republican Party chairman, I believe in the caucus and assembly process. Colorado has a great system that allows people to go through the caucus and assembly process, and there's also an alternative process, and people can get on the ballot. Now, there have been a series of congressmen, and let me see how many of you have heard of these congressmen. Bob Beaupre. You might have heard of Bob? Yeah, you might have been involved here in Jefferson County when he won, having petitioned onto the ballot, not gone through the assembly. Tom Tancredo, you might have heard of him, also from this area, also someone who petitioned on. Doug Lamborn. Now I know he's all the way from down in Colorado Springs, but in at least one of his congressional races he petitioned on. Mike Kaufman, in his first race, petitioned onto the ballot. So it's not just those people who petition on. We have a variety of people who choose to do that. But most people in Colorado get on the ballot through the caucus and assembly process. In fact, last election cycle, even with 4 candidates for U.S. Senate, Dick, including yours, choosing to petition on, there were only 10 Republicans in the over 100 seats where you go through the state process, 65 state representatives, 17 or 18 state senators, a bunch of district attorneys across the state. Out of all, State Board of Education, Regent, Congress, and U.S. Senate, there were a total of 10 candidates who chose to petition on. Everybody else came in through the caucus and assembly process. Everybody else. There were also, by the way, 10 Democrats who petitioned on. So it was an equal number of both parties. And that's kind of the history and background of where we are. Now, let me talk about a couple things that you have the ability to do. How many of you know what taper is? I think most of you have probably heard of it. How many of you like some aspects of taper? Let me say, how many of you like that the government can't raise your taxes without you voting on it? The government can't incur debt without you voting on it. And in fact, spending can't increase without you voting on it. How would you feel if someone came and took that ability away? You would be ticked off. How many of you went to your caucuses last year? How many of you had at least one person at the caucus that was ticked off that there was not a meaningless straw poll conducted? Right? And by the way, we haven't always done a straw poll. That's something we added 8 years ago?
2008.
2008?
Yeah.
That would be 8 years before 2016. I was not crazy. So we added it. We had it in 2 cycles, and we hadn't had it before. But it was kind of cool. You know, we'd generate some interest, get some people to come out. But it's not something we had before. And when we canceled a non-binding, meaningless straw poll, there was outrage at the caucus. What do you mean, I can't vote? I came here to vote. Well, yes, you're voting to elect county delegates who will in turn elect congressional delegates and state delegates, and those individuals will choose national delegates, and those individuals will vote for a president for you, which is the process that we were using before. And people were outraged that they couldn't vote in a straw poll. And so that's kind of the background. So as we went into the 2016 legislative session, I think I was going to use the PowerPoint here. I think most of you have at least a copy of it here. So you'll see, as you look at it, a little bit of my history with a little more details of, by the way, I was a county commissioner. I went to the caucus. I was clerk and recorder, went to the caucus. Secretary of State, went to the caucus. So that's kind of my history. And you'll see, I guess I should give you a couple notes about how much do Coloradans like to vote? A lot. We have the highest percentage of registered voters in the United States of America, here in Colorado. In all of the last 3 presidential elections, we have had one of the states that's been in the top 5 in terms of percentage of eligible voters who voted in that election. And we like to vote on lots of stuff, not just taxes and Tabor-related issues, whether, you know, all sorts of things have been there, from bear trapping to pig farms to significantly more important things, marijuana, both medical and recreational. All of those have been because Coloradans like to vote. And we like to have the ability to make decisions. And it's great. Where'd Tim go? Did Leonard sneak out? There he is. So it's nice that we have someone who we can trust to vote like a conservative in the House. Yes. But even then, we still don't want him making all the decisions for us because we still want the right to vote and make decisions. So even if you trust him, you're not going to get rid of Tabor and say, hey, Tim, good luck. Oh, by the way, there aren't 35 of him. There aren't 33 of him. It's 28. Is that what it is? And that's the generous number. So no, we don't want to. Even if we like them, we still don't want them to make all the decisions for us because we like the right to vote. And Coloradans vote. We had 2.9 million voters this last election. 2.6 million of them voted by mail. 2.7 almost. About 200,000 chose to go into a polling place and cast their ballot there. So we are active in that process, and we like to do it. You'll see a couple slides on Tabor there, following that statistic. Now, not everybody likes that. In fact, Andy Kerr, who some of you may have heard of, just maybe, may have heard of, wanted to take away your right to vote on issues, and in fact sued in federal court saying the people shouldn't have the ability to vote. Now, he was joined by a number of other people. He happened to be the first one on the list. And so Kerr versus Colorado eventually gets dismissed by the federal court, saying it's without basis. And that, yes, the people have the right to govern themselves and make their own decisions. But most of the people in this room were probably not jumping up and down when Andy said, I want to take away your right to vote. And I'm guessing that's probably the case. When the straw poll went away, if you'll see the nice little headline for the Drudge Report here, furious Colorado has no primary or caucus, which wasn't exactly true. There was a caucus. You just couldn't vote at it. Cruz celebrates voterless victory. Now, full disclosure, I was a Ted Cruz delegate to the National Convention. I voted for Ted Cruz. As soon as that vote was done and Donald Trump became the nominee, I supported Donald Trump. I didn't agree with everything he did. I don't agree with my wife on everything. There is a wide variety of people within our Republican Party. But when I look at Neil Gorsuch and say, is that a better Supreme Court nominee than Hillary Clinton would have chosen? Yeah, it's pretty easy because I'm not sure she knew there were judges in Colorado. So, Colorado likes to do this. So if you'll see then this nice headline for the Denver Post, which commented on the fact we canceled our straw poll. Colorado GOP blundered on 2016 presidential caucus. And you can look online and you can read the whole article if you want. But you don't need the Denver Post to tell you that because you were there. And you saw the people that walked out when you told them they couldn't vote. Even though they were going to have the chance to vote for delegates, who could vote for delegates, who could vote for delegates, who could vote for the president. So, following that, a number of us tried to work with the state legislature to pass a presidential primary bill because we recognized that Coloradans wanted a presidential primary, and if we did not adopt a presidential primary, there would be an initiative process that would do one that perhaps didn't have the provisions in it the same as we thought would be better. Unfortunately, that failed. And I told the Senate that if it fails, the initiatives are likely going to pass. But they weren't able to reach consensus. You'll see a quote from Senator Lundberg there who sponsored it. We tried, but in the end, there just wasn't enough consensus to pass it. So that then leads to Propositions 107 and 108. 107 establishes a presidential primary and provides that unaffiliated voters are able to vote in it. Not surprising to anybody, that passed, but with the momentum from it, 108 also passed. And I'm going to skip over to 108 there. So, first, let me make sure you know the background. In Colorado, historically, I've told you how people get on the ballot. You either get 30% of the assembly or you petition on. Almost everybody goes to the caucus and assembly. Sometimes we nominate someone who didn't get the most votes at the caucus assembly, but most of the candidates, over 90%, go through the caucus and assembly process to get on the primary ballot. 108 does not change that at all. It is still the same process. It is still the same number of signatures necessary to make the ballot. Nothing else changes except the way the primary election is conducted. So it does not kill the caucus, it does not eliminate the caucus, and in fact, for many races, I suspect that the nominees will still be chosen at the caucus. And depending on where you live, the election practically takes place at the caucus. So if you go a little bit south into Douglas County, Tony Spurlock is sheriff. There was no other name on the ballot in the primary. There was no other name on the ballot in the general election that had a realistic chance of winning in Douglas County. Tony Spurlock is sheriff because he beat two other candidates at the caucus and assembly process. And neither of the others got the necessary 30%. Now, one filed as a write-in candidate, but most of you can figure out how that likely ended. Because if you can't get 30% of the people to vote for you who know you, it's really hard for you to get 50% of the people to vote for you and put your name down and even know what your name is. So that's the process that we use. In that primary that took place every year, unaffiliated voters could vote by walking up on Election Day at 6:59 p.m. and saying, I want to vote in the Republican primary. I wish to be a Republican for this. If they were in the other party, they had to switch a little bit ahead of time. Now, I happen to know some people have done that over time. My bishop was a Democrat when I was running for county commissioner 16 years ago, and he switched to being a Republican so he could vote for me. So I have encouraged people at times to do that, and that's the right that has been there. And as you know, when you affiliated, we don't take any tests to see if you really believe like we believe. You're not required to take a loyalty oath. And as a Republican, you are still free to vote for a Republican or Democrat or anybody else when you come down to the election. And that's true if you're a Democrat, it's true if you're Libertarian, Green, whatever you may be registered as. That's the history, that's the background. The new law changes that. And it says that unaffiliated voters, instead of being able to walk in and affiliate, will be sent ballots. And by ballots, I mean, yes, plural. They'll be sent a Democratic ballot and a Republican ballot. And they will have the choice as to which to return. If they return both and having voted both of them, their vote will not count at all. And that's true even if they voted for different people. So if they voted for Ed Perlmutter and Cynthia Kaufman for a different office, that ballot, neither of those ballots counts, that goes away, and that vote is not counted at all. If they choose to vote for people on only the Republican ballot or only the Democratic ballot, that vote counts the same as anybody else's. So that's the general process that is allowed. You guys are aware of the arguments that people gave. I should note that unaffiliated voters do have the option under House Bill or Senate Bill 305 from last year to say in advance, just send me the Republican ballot, just send me the Democratic ballot for this election. I know this is the one I want to participate in. You don't even need to send me the other one. So that's an option they have. But if they don't exercise the option, they will get both the Democratic and the Republican ballot. And regardless of how you vote in the primary, just like it's always been, you can still vote for whomever you wish in the general election. So the packet then gives you some of the rules that have been adopted so that you know how this is going to work. So I'm not going to read the rules to you. If you happen not to have gotten a PowerPoint, and thank you, by the way, for making those. I appreciate it.
And I'm going to send it to everybody. Everybody here, I have their email, so they're going to get it.
So you're going to get it in email so you can read it in electronic format. You can also go online to the Secretary of State's website and read the whole rules if you wish. Basically, here's how it's going to work. If the clerk is able to come up with a way to identify which ballot is inside your envelope ahead of time without opening it, then that'll just be processed like a regular ballot. How might they do that, you say? Well, there might be a stripe that appears through a window where they just see the color of the ballot. There might be a different thickness, weight of the paper. And so their machine can say, this is a heavier envelope, this therefore must be a Republican ballot, and the lighter one must be the Democratic ballot. So we don't tell them how to do it, just we say it's not dependent on what the voter does, though. So you don't have to check something to make sure it matches. So you get to turn that in, and then it'll caution them they can't vote both. I should note, if you look on the next page, Rule 7.5.8, they cannot know the name when they're making the determination if they have to look at the ballot, and that's an important part. And so the way that process works, if you look at 7.5.13, if the clerk has not established that, or they don't use one of these cool little ways of the stripe, or they don't want to do it, here's what will happen. How many of you, by the way, have been an election judge before? Thank you for doing that. I'm happy to see so many names, because the only way elections work is with people like you serving as judges. So what will happen is that a judge, this is after we verify the signature, of course, the judge will pull out the secrecy sleeve and hand it to two judges. Those two judges, one Democrat, one Republican, will then look at the ballot inside, not knowing whose envelope it is, and they will make the determination. as to whether it was a Democrat ballot that was returned or a Republican ballot that was returned. Or if they returned both, whether they had voted on both of them or not. So that's the process that's going to follow. It takes a little longer, but it's important to ensure that we don't have someone who's voting in both primaries. That's the process. Now, a third of the state is unaffiliated. But that's not an entirely accurate picture. Because if you look at the close races, they don't change by 33%. 5% of the people in this state voted for Cory Gardner and I, and voted for John Hickenlooper. 5%. That's the difference. Governor won by about 3 points. Cory and I won by 2 to 3 points. That's the 5 to perhaps 10% in a wider swing who are making the decisions. So there's about a third of the unaffiliated voters who truly fluctuate. And there's about a third that typically vote Republican, and there's about a third that typically vote Democratic. That's the rough mix. You can find exceptions. You can also find some Republicans that voted for a Democrat. You can find some Democrats that voted for a Republican as well. Because we don't track how you as an individual vote. We just track whether you vote in the process. So that's the process that's going to be used when the ballots come in to the county clerk. What does that mean? It means that everyone's going to have a chance to vote. And if you're an unaffiliated voter, you will not have to affiliate in order to turn in a Republican or a Democratic ballot. You'll pick one. Percentage-wise, and this is the part that we're not positive on, is you're still going to have most of the votes, right? If every unaffiliated voted in one party's primary, it would be half and half. But some of them are going to vote Democrat, some are going to vote Republican, and historically, unaffiliates vote at a lower rate than affiliated members do. So perhaps, my guess, somewhere between 65 and 85% of the people who vote in the Republican primary are going to be affiliated. I want to do most of the questions at the end, so if it's, can we do that? But I will call it. So that's the process. I should note, and this is one of the things you've seen a little bit in the news, that the party does have the opportunity under this proposition to have a 75% vote of the Central Committee, and if the State Central Committee's members, 75% of them, vote to cancel the primary entirely. There is no primary. You stay at the caucus and assembly. You stay at that assembly until you get a nominee, and rules have to be provided for that. You could go 3 ballots. When I went to my first convention in 1981, the balloting for lieutenant governor went 3 ballots, and so it was a very long day. You could have multiple day assemblies if you don't have, if you look at the number of people running for governor, and you say you have to get 50%, it might take 10 or 20 ballots before we get there. But that's the process. What that means, practically, is then the roughly 1 million Republicans who don't go to their caucus, and the half of the unaffiliates who might want to vote in that primary, are going to be told you're not allowed to vote for the primary candidate. Now, based on your feelings, if we took away your right to vote for Tabor, based on the feelings of the caucus goers when we took away the meaningless straw poll, we can at least presume that some of the people who you tell can't vote will be less than ecstatic about that. And if one party cancels and the other doesn't, you could bet that the party that lets the people vote is going to be much more aggressive about telling people, we let people vote and the other party didn't. But that's the process that we go through. There have been, and so you'll see a couple Denver Post articles here, one by John Frank, which kind of outlines both people's views. So you've got Jack Viana, who's the Denver County Republican chairman, who said it would be political suicide for the Republican Party to opt out, given that the Democrats are not. And then you have a Central Committee member from Adams County who says the caucus system is the only way, quote, to select a candidate who will adhere to the party platform and our conservative principles, close quote. So those are kind of the competing views. You also have the headline for an op-ed that Dick Wadhams can talk about at length if you want to talk to him later today, saying that Colorado Republicans should not cancel because Republican candidates should embrace 108 as an opportunity to craft their campaign messages to not only reflect Republican values, but to attract unaffiliated voters as well. I happen to live in a county where that may not be terribly important, right? I ran for county commissioner the first time and I got 84% of the vote in the general election. It was an open seat and the Democrats didn't even run anybody. There was a libertarian on the ballot, he got 16%, and that was it. When I ran for county clerk the first time, I got outspent 3-1 by the Democrat, who got 32% of the vote. So in some counties, that may not matter if you don't appeal to unaffiliated voters or if you tick them off. But in counties like Jefferson, I'm willing to bet that some of your candidates aren't telling people, I only want to vote you to vote for me if you're a Republican. Christine, that's bad advice. Don't do that. I will tell you statewide that as a Republican candidate, if I didn't get votes from people who were unaffiliated and some Democrats, I would not be the Secretary of State. And that's going to be true for whoever a governor is. So ultimately, our party has a choice, and the Central Committee gets to make that call. So there are probably, who's here on the Central Committee, so you know who you need to. Okay, so if you see the people who have hands up, these are the people you should talk to and lobby as to what you think is the right answer. I will tell you that as the Secretary of State, I've run generally on a platform of people should be able to vote. That's what I believe. I believe in the caucus and assembly process. That's not changing as a result of the process. But I think if we were to tell people they have to go to the caucus to vote, and otherwise they don't get a vote at all, that we're going to tick off an awful lot of voters. And I'll also note that there's some people, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, some of us are dedicated, right? We got babysitters on caucus night so we can go. The Williamses have 4 children, and we never missed a caucus. But not every voter spends 3 hours on Tuesday night and all day on a Saturday for the county assembly and all day at, drives to Boulder or Colorado Springs or wherever for the state assembly. That's not what most people do. I think it's an important process, and I think for lots of races it works extraordinarily well. And I think that's where most of our candidates come from, and I think it's a great way to get those candidates onto the ballot. But I think there's a risk if we say to the 1 million Republicans who aren't there and the 500,000 unaffiliates who we need to win an election, we don't want you to vote. And they will react the same way the people did when you told them they can't vote in a meaningless straw poll. A meaningless straw poll, now we're telling them they can't vote at all. Ponder how they're going to react there. And the same way I would react if you told me I'm going to do away with Tabor and I'm not going to let you vote on those issues. So that's kind of my background as to where we are and the decision that has to be made. It's going to be made at the State Central Committee meeting. And I promised Joe to call on you, and I will definitely get to you, Cliff. Sir.
Okay, so going back to the how they determine, how they validate that any one voter in the primary only votes one ballot, not both, right?
Correct.
So you're looking at me? Hi. Okay, so in there it says it gets put into the score database when it's, so this person returned this ballot. Is that what it's saying?
Correct. So what happens right now in a primary, you can look up a voter history.
Yep.
and find out whether someone votes frequently.
Yes.
If you have ever used a walking list, if you've ever used a phone list, if you've ever done a mailing, you have used typically that voter history. Because when I was knocking on doors the first time I ran against a guy who'd been city council and I'd never been anything, against a guy who spent more money than anyone else in El Paso County history, when I was running against him, I pulled up the list and went to the doors of Republicans who always vote. So what you will have in future years, instead of kind of the free-for-all we have in 2016, is you will have a list. And it says, if you want to pull it up, you could pull up the voter history and say, what primary did this person vote in 2016? You will not know how they voted,
Yes.
but you will know that that particular unaffiliated voted in a Republican primary.
And that is public, that's going to...
That is public. It is not a guarantee how they voted,
Yes.
and it's not a guarantee they liked the person.
Agree.
Because someone could choose, particularly if there's nothing interesting on their side, to go and vote for the weaker candidate or the one who is more close to their opposite philosophy. But given that you have both parties with a primary, to do that, that means I don't get to choose. If I really want to say that Barlock's the guy, or if I think Barlock's opponent is horrible, and so I want Barlock's opponent as the nominee, I have to forego the ability to vote for Polis or Johnson or any of the other people on the Democratic side, and I have to give up that ability to vote in the Democratic primary. So there may be some game playing, but game playing can occur now simply by walking in and affiliating.
Do you see, because are people already challenging this? Because, like this, say, Republican primary ticket, there's only one seat that's really contested. It could be possible.
I think if you talk to Justin Everett,
Yeah.
or Polly Lawrence, or Kevin Lundberg,
Well,
or
agreed in 18, there's a ton of people piling in, but there is potentially some election in the future. Do you see them trying to challenge the legal merits if, like, oh, well, I returned a Republican ballot and there was only one contested race, that you're going to know how I voted or something, they're going to try to challenge it.
So I don't think that challenge will come from someone saying you know how I voted, because that risk is already there. So I was clerk and recorder in El Paso County. We have a precinct for the Air Force Academy. Thousands of people live on the Air Force Academy. Most of them aren't registered in Colorado because they stay Texas and Florida residents, so they don't pay income tax.
Yeah.
Smart move on their part. In the Democratic primary between Michael Bennett and Andrew Romanoff, in the entire precinct, 2 people returned a Democratic ballot. Now, I think that says something for the Republican proclivities, perhaps, of the Air Force. It also says how many of them weren't Colorado residents and didn't vote at all. So that risk is already there, but I'm not going to know. In a state, in a county like El Paso, when I was clerk a few years ago, the Democrats had, in many of the areas, a single candidate, an unopposed C regent candidate named Steve Ludwig. And all the others in the Democratic ballot said there are no candidates for this office. State rep, commissioner, state senator, there are no candidates for this office. Same thing happens sometimes on the Republican ballot if you go down the street into Denver. In that instance, am I more likely to return the ballot that has races to vote in it? Sure. But statewide, you're usually going to have something of contest, something of interest. Cliff.
So, what great presentation. You really covered the facts, and I really liked how you laid out your arguments. Well done.
We can't hear you.
One of the things that you need to know on the, and I'm not advocating one position or the other, the state central committee consists of 510 people, of which there are 488 votes. Some county vice chairs, some counties have multiple vice chairs, so they each get a third or a half a vote. That's why there's some more people, less votes. 3/4 of the committee will have to vote to opt out should they do so. Historically, we're lucky to get 400 people. 3/4 of 488 is 366. This is a very high bar to reach. I just let you chew on that for a little.
So you're saying 75% of the on-paper delegates, not the people who show up?
It is 75% of the people who have votes. And so if only 300 people show up, it's literally impossible.
Okay.
And getting Republicans to agree with unanimity on things
That's impossible.
is challenging. Sir.
You've explained to us that an unaffiliated voter will receive 2 ballots, and he is to mark only one. Is he to return the one he marked and the unmarked, or is that unmarked ballot left in his possession free to float around?
So, the unmarked ballot is left in their possession, just like anyone who doesn't return a ballot. That ballot is left in their possession. But remember, before that ballot can be counted, let's say someone else found it and wanted to return it, they would have to have a signature that matches the signature on file. And we check. How do I know we check? Because 21,000 ballots in this state were not counted in the presidential election because the signature was not present, or the signature did not match, or there was no ID for a new voter. And that's true. It's about a 0.8% rejection rate occurs whether it's a Republican clerk or Democratic clerk. It takes a Democrat and Republican agreeing that that is not a valid signature. And what happens is the individual gets a letter and says, hey, your signature doesn't match. I know this happens. I sent him out as clerk. My daughter got a letter from me saying, dear Wendy, your ballot does not count because your signature did not match. And she called me up and said, Dad, what's going on? And I went and looked, and when she got her driver's license, Wendy was very proud. And every letter in her name was there. And by the time she was a college student, it was a scrawl. And so her ballot did not count at that point. But Colorado gives you until 8 days after the election to correct the issue. She did, so her ballot did count. And so we use that process. So finding that ballot, or finding a ballot that got sent to someone who no longer lives there, will not enable someone to vote because we check the signatures. So I appreciate the question. Thanks, Steve.
Just one quick one. Is there a date certain already for the primary?
The date certain for the primary for 2018 is the last Tuesday in June. The presidential primary, which 107 establishes, has some flexibility, and the reason for that is to allow the governor, in consultation with the Secretary of State, to work with other states to perhaps schedule a regional primary or to do it at the best time. Let me see first if there's someone who hasn't spoken yet, since you got 2 minutes already, Steve. Laura.
Thank you for being here. You've done a great job.
Sure.
If they cancel the primaries and the ability to petition on is gone, will it be 30% of the caucus or 50% of the caucus?
So if they cancel the primary, and it's simply the caucus and assembly process, so the caucus still elects delegates. At the assembly, the proposed rules anticipate at least a majority. And it probably works the way it works now for state chairman, because the bylaws haven't been adopted yet on all this. But after a couple ballots, you start dropping the lowest one. If you don't have that rule, you wind up like the Democrats' State Central Committee meeting they held, in which they had elections for vice chair, and nobody ever won. Really, no one won. They adjourned with no selection having been made because no one ever got a majority. And then they worked out that, well, okay, the person first, but without a majority, would be the main one and would call the others the deputy second vice chairs or whatever the title was they had. So there will be a process. We'll need to have that process because eventually you have to have a way of getting to a majority. Now, I know historically the Republican National Convention hasn't had that, so if you go back, I think the Democrats once won 124 ballots before choosing the losing candidate for president. But think of how many, it's a sacrifice to be there on a Saturday. How many of you want to be there for a week? How many of you can be there for a week? Russ?
Historically, there was a papal election that took 18 months.
That would be hard to get a nominee on the ballot.
And they finally the townspeople took the roof off the building to encourage the electors to get with it. But my question will be on 107. What happens if the winner of this presidential primary is totally out of consideration come May or June or whatever? Where do these electors then go?
So in the presidential primary, part of it's going to depend upon party rules, and part of it depends on what you mean by totally out of consideration.
Drop down.
So that's different than has no chance to win. So, right, because you can really beat, John Kasich was totally out of consideration in Cleveland, but he was still a candidate. Other candidates had dropped out, some had suspended their campaigns, and so it's going to be up to party rules in large part to define what happens. If the person's gone, those delegates get reallocated based on who came in second, typically. That's how that works. Sir?
I have a question.
Jim.
I just want to make sure I understand. So because of 107, if it's a presidential primary year, an unaffiliated voter could vote for a presidential candidate from one party and, say, a senatorial candidate from the other. Is that right or not right?
That is correct, because they are separate elections. And so what you choose to vote in the presidential race does not impact what you vote in the other. Steve?
Third party problems. What happens if we have multiple candidates from a third party come along?
So third parties, as we look at the rules, as we look at the law that was adopted, it refers to the person being sent major party ballots. So if the American Constitution Party is a major party, as it was after Tancredo's race, when we nominated a candidate that did not do particularly well, I think he got 11 or 12% of the vote. And Tom became, because he got more than 10% of the vote, the American Constitution Party became a major party for a 4-year period. If you are not a major party, your members get the primary ballot, but as we look at the law as passed, it refers to voters getting the major party ballots, not every minor party that might have a contest. Ma'am.
I've seen the unaffiliated voter getting the 2 ballots.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one envelope to send in 1 ballot? Can they send in 2 ballots and separately? Is there a way to figure out that they've done this already?
So the question is, how do you stop them from sending both ballots in different envelopes? So they only get 1 envelope to return it in. They only get 1 secrecy sleeve. They don't get 2 of each. How do we know they haven't turned in the other one? Many of you have probably wondered, as you looked at the envelope, what that barcode was that's sitting on the envelope. And those of you that have been election judges who have worked at the central count know that when that ballot is returned, it is scanned in, not the envelope. The ballot is scanned in on that barcode, and that tells us that Laura Boggs has now voted. And so if we get another ballot from Laura, let's say she moved and tried to return that one, or she tries to return the other party's ballot, or she tries to vote in person, that's going to show up in the statewide voter database, and that other ballot is not going to be counted. So it's the first returned. It's the first one we get back. If you have scanned in at an in-person polling place, and then your mail ballot comes in, we're not going to count the mail ballot. And that's why you have to have the statewide internet connectivity so that someone can't vote in more than one location. So even though Jefferson County will have about 25 places to vote in person, we will know once you voted at the first one, so when you go to another one, whether you return a second ballot, a different ballot, the same party ballot, no matter what you do, we're going to know what happened there. Sir, thought I saw a hand back there.
You just answered my question.
Just answered, great. Who has not made a comment yet? Bill?
My question is, with the presidential primary, now, they're stealing, the government stole
Speak up,
my
Bill.
Republican Party
Thank you.
rights. And so how do we do that? How do we let the have my rights stolen by this proposition?
So,
What's his question?
Yeah, what's
the question is, how can the rights be stolen? The argument from the people who passed this, and the people of Colorado who did, is that the people of Colorado pay for the primary, and because all of the people pay for it, all of the people should have the opportunity to vote in. That's one of the arguments in terms of fairness. Is it potentially subject to legal challenge? Sure, someone could, but similar propositions have been upheld in other states. Similar rules have been upheld in other states. Catherine?
Is there any projection as to an increased cost that's going to be involved here?
Increased cost. So, roughly, and this is where we don't have perfect data, but you're going to have a third more ballots get mailed out. To unaffiliates, they're going to have to get both. You're going to have the processing cost of that. So you don't have to get more polling places. So I think probably the cost of the election goes up by a third. And the way it's presented is that ultimately the counties bear the cost of that increase. And the presidential primary, which got added as a third election in every 4 years, the counties had most of the cost of that. The General Assembly, however, with my support, did pass a bill saying the General Assembly's general fund is going to pay for the presidential primary. So that kind of balanced out a little bit. But that's
We have time for one more question.
One more, sir.
I was just going to ask about the signature verification changing in 2018, what
Good point.
that all is.
Thanks. That was in the notes, but I forgot to talk about it. So, some of you are aware that some candidates and some ballot issues have relied upon petition gatherers who are not wholly trustworthy. Or in other words, have been convicted of petition fraud. Recognizing that, I went to the General Assembly and worked with the Democrats in the House and the Republicans in the Senate to get a bill passed that provides for signature verification for candidate petitions. Senator Neville was one of the sponsors of that from here in Jefferson County. His son was one of the House sponsors of it. And so it provides that for candidate petitions, for the first time in Colorado history, we will now be checking to see if the signature matches on those petitions, just like we do with the ballot envelopes that come in. And so now we are no longer totally reliant upon that minimum wage worker or that incentivized worker who's paid $12 a signature or $3 a signature, who looks at the end of the day and says, if I add a few more people, I'll get more money.
Yeah.
And some of them gave way to temptation and did what they shouldn't have, but now we will check signatures. That's the first time we've done that in Colorado history. It is a better process, and it's going to make it so you can have more integrity in that petition process than you've had in the past.
And quick follow-up, will it have that same 8-day window that your daughter had? Like if somebody's signature changes organically, will they have that chance? Will it fall through that way as well?
There is a cure period. I think it's a little bit less than 8, in part because the way it works is we have to finish each person's petition in the order it's sent in before we go on to the next ones. So Jack Graham's petition got turned in first of the 4 U.S. Senate petitions. Ryan Frazier's got turned in last. We had to finish all of the others before we could get to Ryan's, because if someone signed more than one, only the one turned in first counts. And so if you signed Jack Graham's and then you signed Ryan Frazier's, then we have to know whether Jack's was valid before we move on to Ryan. So that's why it's a shorter window, but there is a short cure opportunity. I would note, if you're planning on petitioning on, plan on needing a bigger margin than you have had in the past, because we're going to be checking. By the way, waiting to the last minute means you were probably the last one turning in. So Mr. Wadham's back there, being somewhat of an experienced campaigner, made sure that Jack Graham's petition was turned in first. So Mr. Graham knew that he was on the ballot while Ryan was still trying to figure out whether he was going to be on the ballot or not. And so if you're planning on petitioning on, don't wait till the last minute, because just like everything else, if you go to the motor vehicle office on the last day of the month, you'll wait in line. And as a candidate, if you wait till the last second to turn in your petition, you will wait in line. Please don't do that. Please, you'll get an answer quicker. Joe, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
I want to.
Oh, you get chairman's prerogative to ask a final question.
No. What I was told was that I cut this off prematurely, that there are more questions, so here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, it's up to him, is what I was going with.
That's
If he has to-
exactly. It's your call.
I'm
You
here.
cut it off whenever.
I'm
you want.
happy to answer until we start getting repetitive or redundant. And I am happy to try to provide the information I can. Yes, wait, let me just ask. I'm not trying to pick on you, but is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who has a question? Okay, because I want to.
What's the penalty for the person who got the petitions that they were an illegal person, plus the signatures were?
So the penalty is on the person who gathers the illegal signatures and vouches for it.
Did you prosecute that?
All three were prosecuted. One of them was like a 19-year-old kid who got a plea bargain for a fairly light sentence. One was a repeated felon, a repeated criminal who got a higher sentence. And so it varied depending on what their history and background was.
Okay.
But we do prosecute. Yes.
I just have a slightly off-topic question, and that is who controls how individuals who live in assisted living facilities receive their ballots?
Yes.
So, if you live in assisted living and you have an individual mailbox, you get your ballot just like anybody else with an individual mailbox. If you have a collective, and I think the threshold is 10, if I remember right, then a bipartisan team of judges with a Democrat and a Republican from the county clerk's office go and ask the individual and assist them in completing their ballot. And it is their job to do whatever that person tells them to. So this got related to me from a friend in Garfield County. They asked the person who happened to be living in a memory care facility, because we don't have a competency requirement to vote, who she wanted to vote for president. And her answer was Roosevelt. And so that is the name they wrote down on the write-in line. Now, I think they could have asked a clarification. Do you mean Teddy or Franklin? But that's the law. Some people get frustrated by that, but query where you would go as to who's competent and who's not, and who makes that decision, because there are some risks there if you start saying, and I may not know very much, and I may still think I want the Republican or the Democrat, but that's the rule in Colorado.
My issue had more to do with the competency of the individual who was questioning my relative as opposed to the competency of my relative.
It should have been a bipartisan team unless they get individual mail, in which case it's just like anybody else who gets individual mail.
It didn't work quite like that. So.
And if there's specific issues, I am happy to do it. I'm going to pass out my cards somewhere. There they are. Joe, if you wouldn't mind passing those out. Ma'am, now I'll get back to you.
I just have a simple question. You know, the citizen's driver's license every 5 or 6 years. Is the signature on the current driver's license the one you use, or how does that work?
So we use the most recent signature from the voter. And so after each election, our rules require the clerk to scan, I think within 90 days, the signatures that were on the ballot. So my daughter's corrected new signature is now going to be the signature on file for Wendy. And so we update it throughout the process, so we're not looking at a signature that in some of your cases might be 40 years old. So we do that on a periodic basis. Sorry.
Does somebody contact the signator to alert them that their signatures in the past?
Yes, as I mentioned, they get a letter sent to the voter saying your signature did not match. You have until 8 days after the election. That's the letter my daughter got. Ma'am.
I'm just curious, kind of going back to the Proposition 1 anyway, how is the Senate primary going to be different than the presidential process?
Okay, so there's one primary for every office except president. So that will have, depending on the year, governors, the all-important Secretary of State's race, treasurer, attorney general, U.S. Senate, House, State Senate, State Board of Ed, Board of Regents, assessor, clerk and recorder, coroner,
RTD,
and all sorts of others. So that'll be one ballot. And the presidential primary will be by itself. Some people have asked, why is the presidential primary separate? And the answer is because we wanted to be early enough so we matter. Because think of the length of the process for the other primary, right? Ballots go out 45 days ahead of time for the military. Takes a while for the caucus and assembly process. And so June is about as quick as you can do, unless you wanted to be caucusing on Thanksgiving Day, have the assembly on Christmas Day. The advantage is the schools would be open, they're not being used too much. But that's a challenge. Let me take two more from people who haven't asked questions yet. Yes, well, you definitely get to ask one.
Looking at from the administrative end, the government has told the parties what to do. At a certain point, you elect 2 precinct committee people. You report to us on all of your findings. So that was what I come up with at this point is, okay, if everybody considers the our burden, all of that, are there some things that could be eased up on rules in the future for the parties so that we don't quite have, you don't have to meet on a Tuesday? I think we have to change the date. You understand where I'm going with there?
Yeah, so Propositions 107 and 108 are actually statutory. So can fixes be done or other things be done to loosen up, saying instead of all the primaries or all the caucuses are on the same day where you're fighting for the same space, could you split them up? And that's something that can be done legislatively. So you happen to have a state representative who's here you can visit with on that issue. Remember that it's going to take both Democrats and Republicans to pass it in the current scenario. But it is an issue that both parties recognize. And so if there are some practical solutions, we're certainly willing to look at that. We have eased up some of the requirements. We've tried to make it easier, for example, for campaign finance filings. Some of you are aware that our campaign finance system depends upon people, most of whom are volunteers, being county party treasurers. And Jefferson's a little more sophisticated than some. But if you go up in the mountains, you know, or your Republican Women's Club, you get someone who's willing to be a treasurer, and if they forget something or they make a mistake, in the past it was a $50 a day fine, even if it was an accident, even if there was no intent to do anything wrong. So we worked with the legislature to pass a bill this last time that allows people who made a mistake in good faith to correct it without that fine. Otherwise, at $50 a day, so the El Paso County Republican Party turned in a finance report. Had a Lincoln Day dinner ticket from me. They listed my occupation as retired. I got back at 11:30 last night from an event in Snowmass after having been in Fair Play in Leadville. I do not consider myself retired. That was a $50 a day fine, and there were a few other errors, less than 1% of their total filings, but could have resulted in tens of thousands of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases in fines. So the legislature passed a bill that does provide relief. So if you make an error in good faith or substantially complied with the law, we give you a chance to fix it. So we are trying to ease up on some of the requirements that aren't necessary, and I'm always willing to look at others that are there. Having been a party officer, I know the challenges more than most, even though that was 20 years ago that I did it.
And with caucus, with the prime example, that for Jeffco when we have 5,000 or 8,000 people come to a caucus?
And the challenge with caucus then also gets to messaging, because we were saying, okay, so you live where? So you go on this day, and you go on that day, and that's all part of what we'd have to work out. But there may be a way to do it, so I'm certainly willing to visit with you on it.
I meant the financial reporting, just to be clear. The financial reporting on the caucus is horrible for us.
The financial reporting on the caucus, unfortunately, the threshold of $19.99 is set by a constitutional amendment. So sometimes things get in the Constitution that don't make a lot of sense. People got frustrated with that, and in every county except 4, they passed Raise the Bar, saying we're going to make it a little harder to amend the Constitution in the future so we don't have quite as many constitutional issues that are there. Folks, I appreciate the chance to visit with you. Have I?
I just wanted to ask, why don't they count the military vote first?
The way the vote is counted is we count it as it comes in. So military ballots that are returned early are counted early and are released right at the beginning. But we have a special law in Colorado to say, recognizing sometimes mail service is not as great in a place like Afghanistan.
Yeah.
You get to have up till 8 days after the election for your ballot to arrive. And so if it arrives in that phase, it's going to be counted later along with the signature cures and other things like that. But if you've returned it early as a military member, it's going to get counted early.
Okay,
So,
I just want it to count.
yeah, oh, absolutely counts, and we give them an extra 8 days. Folks, I appreciate it. Let me can I divert for a second? I take off my Secretary of State hat, and I step forward as a candidate for Secretary of State to say
2 minutes.
2 minutes now. Folks, it's important to have a Secretary of State who actually understands the elections process. I have an opponent. She told the people in Aspen she's running to advance the progressive agenda. She's never run an election before.
Oh, gosh.
That's not who I want running elections for the state of Colorado. I think that it's important to have someone who knows what they're doing and is committed to a fair process and an honest process. I ask for your support. It is unfortunately harder to get the word out because not everyone goes to sleep each night saying, let me ponder the Secretary of State candidates. So it would be an incredible help that if you were able to, if you could grab one of these nice envelopes and put $5 or a check for 20 or whatever may be the case in it to help. And I would appreciate your support going forward through the Republican caucus and assembly process that I will be going through. Because I don't have the $200,000 to petition on, and I like the caucus and assembly process, and I would ask for your support in that. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight.
1 minute and 15 seconds. Yeah. So, first off, thank you, Secretary Williams, for coming. How many of y'all like this tonight? Do you want to do it again?
Yes, yes.
We will. Stay tuned for details.